March 1919, a letter arrived at every newspaper in New Orleans, and I want to read it to you, because nothing I say about this case is going to hit harder than the words this man wrote himself. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians call the Axeman. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to the people of New Orleans. Those who do not jazz it on that night, if there be such, will get the axe. He signed it, the Axeman. The letter ran in every paper in the city on the same day. And I want you to picture that morning, people sitting at their kitchen tables, reading their newspaper with their coffee, and getting to that letter, and having to decide whether this was a joke, or whether some man was genuinely promising to come to their home and kill them if they didn't play jazz music loud enough. The city had to make a decision. And what New Orleans did in response is one of the strangest things I've ever read about. They threw parties. Every jazz club in the city packed out until morning. People who didn't own instruments went and hired bands to play in their homes. A composer actually sat down that week and wrote a new song, specifically for the occasion, called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz. It sold out at music shops across the city. And that Tuesday night, March 19th, 1919, not a single person in New Orleans was attacked. He kept his word. But here's the part that doesn't make the headlines. After that night, he kept killing. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. So let me tell you where we are first, because context matters here. New Orleans in 1918 is not a quiet city under normal circumstances. It never has been. But 1918 was a particularly hard year. World War I is still going. American boys are dying overseas. And on top of that, there's a flu pandemic working its way across the country that will end up killing more people than the war did. The city is anxious. People are used to bad news. But what starts happening in May 1918 is a different kind of bad news. The kind that comes from inside the city, from inside the neighborhoods, from inside people's own homes while they sleep. The victims were almost all Italian-American families, grocers mostly, hard-working people who ran small shops out of the front of their homes and lived in the back rooms with their wives and children. A lot of them had immigrated to New Orleans over the past few decades. They had their own tight-knit communities, their own churches, their own social clubs. And someone was targeting them. The method was always the same, and it was always methodical. The attacker would come at night while everyone was asleep. He'd find a wooden panel at the back of the house, a door, a window frame, and chisel through it quietly. This would take time. This was not a rushed, panicked break-in. This was someone who was patient, someone who knew they weren't going to be caught. He'd go inside, and he used an axe, not one he brought with him. That's the part I keep coming back to. He found the axe at the property, from a woodpile, from a shed, from wherever it was kept, and used that. Then he left it at the scene when he was done. He didn't even bring his own weapon. He just picked up whatever was there, and then he walked out the same way he came in and disappeared. The police had no physical evidence, no witnesses who could describe him, no fingerprints, nothing useful. The first attack most investigators are confident about was May 23, 1918. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine. They ran a small grocery. Their brothers lived next door and woke up in the night to sounds they couldn't place. They went to check and found both Joseph and Catherine badly injured. Catherine died before morning. Joseph survived long enough to be questioned. He couldn't say anything useful. And then he died too. Police looked at the Maggio family first. That's what they did in 1918 with Italian immigrant families. They assumed it was internal, a business dispute, family trouble, something that stayed within the community. They arrested one of the brothers briefly. It wasn't him. A few weeks later, Louis Bessemer. He was attacked in his home. His common-law wife Harriet took the worst of it. She survived the initial attack, but her injuries were severe, and she died months later. Bessemer was arrested because, again, police looked inward first. He sat in jail for months. He was eventually acquitted. It wasn't him either. Then a pregnant woman named Mrs. Schneider was attacked in her bedroom while her husband was at work for the night. She survived. The baby survived. She couldn't describe her attacker because she'd been asleep when it started. Then Joseph Romano was killed. And by this point, the city is starting to connect the dots. Same method every time. Same type of victim. Same chiseled panel. Same axe left behind. But here's what made it even more terrifying. There was no motive anyone could find. These weren't robberies. Valuables were left behind. There was no obvious connection between the victims except that they were Italian-American grocers. No disputes, no debts, no enemies anyone could identify. This person was just choosing people and killing them and leaving. And then, after a period of quiet, he came back. And this time, he went after a family with a child. March 1919. Charles and Rose Cortimiglia. They had a 2-year-old daughter named Mary. The attacker came through the back of the house in the same way he always did. Charles was attacked first and badly injured, but survived. Rose was attacked and survived, but their daughter Mary, 2 years old, in the room, was killed. And what happened next was almost as disturbing as the attack itself. Rose Cortimiglia, in the aftermath, accused a neighbor, a man named Orlando Giordano, and his son Frank, who the Cortimiglia family had some kind of conflict with. She was absolutely certain it was them. Charles didn't believe it. He said he'd seen the attacker and it wasn't either of those men. He begged Rose to reconsider. She didn't. Orlando and Frank Giordano were arrested, put on trial, and convicted. Orlando was sentenced to life in prison. Frank was sentenced to death. They hadn't done it. Rose Cortimiglia knew they hadn't done it. A year later, racked with guilt, her marriage had fallen apart, her daughter was dead, and 2 innocent men were sitting in prison. She went to a newspaper and confessed that she'd lied. She'd accused them out of personal hatred, not because she'd witnessed anything. The Giordanos were released. The Axeman was still out there. And it's right around this point, March 1919, the Cortimiglia attack. 2 innocent men in prison for it. Police no closer to the real killer. That the Axeman decided he'd been quiet long enough. He wrote that letter. And look, I've read a lot of true crime stories. I've gone through a lot of dark material for this channel. And I've never come across anything quite like that letter. Because most killers either want to stay hidden or they want to get caught. This person wanted something different. He wanted an audience. He wanted the whole city watching. and he wanted them dancing. But here's what I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the jazz night and everything that comes after it. The attacks didn't stop after March 19th. And somewhere in New Orleans, there was a woman who had looked into the face of the man she believed was responsible. A woman who had decided that if the police weren't going to do anything, she would. And eventually, she did. So the letter publishes on a Thursday. The attacks have been going on for almost a year. People are scared. And now there's a man signing himself the Axeman, claiming to be a supernatural demon and offering the city a deal. Play jazz on Tuesday night and live. Don't play jazz and take your chances. The police didn't know what to do with it. Was it a real threat? Was it someone making a joke out of a genuine tragedy? Was it actually the killer, or someone capitalizing on the fear? They couldn't say. So they put extra officers on the streets that Tuesday night and hoped for the best. Meanwhile, the city made its own arrangements. Restaurants and clubs sold out every reservation they had for Tuesday night. Families who normally went to bed early stayed up. People who couldn't afford a band or a piano played records out of open windows. The wealthier neighborhoods hired orchestras. There's a report of one family, older couple, no instruments, didn't know anyone in the music business, who bought a gramophone specifically for that Tuesday night and played it on repeat from 10 in the evening until sunrise. A local songwriter, Joseph John de Villa, wrote The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa, in the days before the Tuesday. It got played across the city that night, and at 12:15 in the morning, the time specified in the letter, New Orleans was loud, just completely loud. Music from every direction. Nobody was attacked. Not one person in the entire city. He said he'd spare anyone playing jazz. And he was true to his word. And I think about that a lot. Because keeping that promise required him to be out there that night, moving through the city, hearing the music, and deciding deliberately not to act. That's not a monster acting on impulse. That's someone who had a plan, communicated the plan, and then executed it, which honestly makes it more unsettling, not less. 6 weeks after the jazz night, he attacked again. Another man, another chiseled panel, another axe. And then a few months after that, October 1919, a man named Mike Pepitone was killed in his home. Same method. His wife heard the sounds, ran toward the room, and came face to face with a figure heading toward the window. The figure went out the window before she could do anything. Mike Pepitone died. He was the last person the Axeman is known to have killed. And then the attack stopped completely. No more chiseled panels, no more axes left behind, no more letters, just silence. The city waited. A week passed. A month. 6 months. Nothing. Police didn't close the case. They had no basis to close it because they had no suspect and no arrest. The file stayed open. And New Orleans was left to wonder whether the Axeman had moved to another city, whether he'd died, whether he'd been locked up for something unrelated. And then something happened in Los Angeles that changed everything. Or at least changed what we think we know. Mike Pepitone's widow was a woman named Esther. After her husband's death, Esther moved west to Los Angeles. She was trying to start over, probably. Get away from the house and the neighborhood and all of it. And in December 1920, a little over a year after Mike's death, Esther Pepitone walked up to a man on a street in Los Angeles and shot him dead. His name was Joseph Mumphrey. Police arrested her immediately. She didn't try to run. And when they questioned her, she told them exactly why she did it. She said Joseph Mumphrey was the Axeman of New Orleans. She said she had seen his face the night her husband was killed, that she'd come into that room and seen him at the window, and she'd known who he was. Now, was she telling the truth? Did she actually recognize him that night? Or was she using Mumphrey as a convenient target for grief and rage? Here's the thing. When investigators looked into Joseph Mumphrey, they found that he had an extensive criminal history in Louisiana. He was a known figure, had been in and out of prison for years. And when they mapped his criminal history against the timeline of the Axeman attacks, specifically the gaps, the overlap was hard to ignore. The Axeman attacks that anyone can trace go back to around 1911 in some accounts, with similar methods and similar victims. And every gap in those attacks, the years where nothing happened, matched up with years when Joseph Mumphrey was sitting in a prison cell. When Mumphrey was locked up, the Axeman disappeared. When Mumphrey was released, the attacks started again. That's not a confession. It's not proof. And the New Orleans police never officially named him as a suspect, partly because by the time anyone was looking at him seriously, he was already dead. Esther Pepitone was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to 10 years. She served 3 and was released. Joseph Mumphrey was never charged with anything related to the Axeman case. The case was never officially solved. To this day, the Axeman of New Orleans is listed as unidentified. I want to end with something that's been sitting with me since I started researching this. People talk about the jazz night like it's the fun part of the story. And I get it. There's something almost absurd about it. A killer sends a letter to a city. The city responds by throwing the biggest party of the year. And it works. Nobody dies. It's bizarre and darkly comic, and kind of incredible. But I keep thinking about what the letter actually reveals about this person, because writing that letter took confidence that's hard to wrap your head around. He'd already killed multiple people. Police had no idea who he was. He was completely invisible. And instead of staying invisible, instead of being grateful that nobody could find him, he decided to announce himself, to give the whole city a deadline and a deal. He didn't have to do that. There was no tactical reason. It only risked drawing more attention to him. But he did it anyway. I think he was bored of being a secret. The attacks were never about money, never about personal grudges. The victims didn't seem to have a real connection to each other. The theory that makes the most sense to me, looking at the whole thing, is that this person enjoyed the power of it, the fear, the city on edge, the newspapers writing about him. And at some point, attacking people while everyone slept wasn't giving him that anymore. So he wrote a letter. He put himself at the center of the story. He made the whole city respond to him. And then he watched New Orleans stay up all night playing jazz to try to survive. That's a different kind of darkness than just violence. That's someone who wanted to be a story, who wanted people, years later, 100 years later, still talking about him. And here we are. Nobody ever stood in a courtroom and was convicted of the Axeman murders. Nobody ever officially answered for those families. The Maggios, the Cortamiglias, Mike Pepitone. None of them got that. Esther Pepitone got 3 years for killing the man she believed was responsible. Make of that what you will. The case is still open. If you made it this far, thank you. I'll see you in the next one.